The old department store stood like a ghost in the heart of Detroit, a forgotten relic of another era. Its windows, once gleaming and full of life, were now shattered, leaving jagged shards of glass clinging to the frames. The walls, covered in grime and graffiti, seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the floors littered with debris, and shadows lurked in every corner, as if the building itself was trying to hide its secrets. I couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement as I stepped through the broken doors. This was exactly the kind of place I loved to photograph. Abandoned, decaying, yet still holding on to a certain eerie beauty. My name's Hayden, and urban exploration is my passion. There's something about these forgotten places that draws me in, a desire to capture the remnants of what once was before time erases them completely. But as I moved deeper into the store, my excitement was tempered by an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite shake. The building seemed to sigh and creak around me, the faint echoes of its past life whispering through the halls. Oddly arranged items, an overturned chair here, a dusty mannequin there, caught my eye, as if someone or something had been there before me, leaving a trail. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to the natural creepiness of the place. Still, I couldn't ignore the sensation that I was being watched, that something was waiting for me in the shadows, just out of sight. As I ventured deeper into the store, the dim light filtering through the broken windows barely reached the far aisles, casting long, eerie shadows. It was then that I saw it, a mannequin standing alone in the middle of the corridor. It was dressed in tattered clothes that must have once been fashionable, now hanging limp and dusty. A thick layer of grime covered its face, and its arms were bent at unnatural angles, as if someone had hastily positioned it and then left it to decay with the rest of the building. It was completely still, too still, as if it had been waiting there for years. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just another relic of the store's forgotten inventory. But there was something about it that unsettled me. Maybe it was the way it stood slightly off-center, or the way its head was tilted just so, as if listening to something only it could hear. Shaking off the unease, I snapped a few pictures and moved on, trying to refocus on the task at hand. As I continued through the aisles, the unsettling feeling grew. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, something that wasn't there when I turned to look. And then I saw it again. The mannequin, now standing in a different aisle, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure it had been in the other corridor just moments ago, but maybe I was mistaken. Still, a chill crept up my spine. With each turn, the mannequin seemed to reappear, always a little closer, always in a different spot. And it wasn't just its location that changed, its pose did too. The head, which had been tilted, was now slightly turned, the blank eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe I was just confusing it with another mannequin, or perhaps someone else had come into the store without me noticing, moving it as a prank. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. The once empty store now felt alive, filled with a presence that pressed in on me from all sides. Every creak, every distant sound made me jump, and I realized with growing dread that the mannequin wasn't just moving, it was following me. My breath quickened, and my curiosity quickly turned to fear. I needed to get out, but the store had become a maze, and every path I took seemed to lead me back to the mannequin, now more lifelike than ever, its cold, glassy eyes locked onto mine. I had seen enough. My unease had turned into outright fear, and all I wanted was to get out of that store. But as I turned to retrace my steps, I froze. The mannequin was standing directly in front of me, blocking my path. It was impossible. There was no way it could have moved so silently, so quickly. But there it was, its cold, lifeless eyes staring right at me. And then I saw its face. The expression had changed. Where there had been nothing but a blank, featureless face before, there was now a grotesque, twisted smile. The lips, cracked and dusty, were curled in a way that no mannequins should be, stretching impossibly wide. The eyes, once empty, now seemed to glint with a malevolent intelligence, as if it was mocking me, daring me to move. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. Panic set in. I spun around, looking for another way out, but every direction I turned, there was another mannequin. They were everywhere now, emerging from the shadows, their poses unnatural, their heads tilted in that same unnerving way, all of them watching me. The mannequins had multiplied, surrounding me, their blank faces all twisted into that same horrible grin. I backed away, desperate to find an escape, but the store that had once seemed vast and open now felt like a suffocating labyrinth, the aisles closing in on me. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I tried to find a clear path, but every exit was blocked. The mannequins seemed to shift, moving silently when I wasn't looking, always staying just out of sight until I turned to face them. The sense of dread was overwhelming, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. The store had become a maze of terror, with no clear way out, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was trapped. The walls seemed to close in as the mannequins tightened their circle, their cold, glassy eyes tracking my every move. My vision blurred as panic overtook me, and I stumbled back, desperate to escape the nightmare I'd walked into. But the more I struggled, the more hopeless it became. The mannequins were no longer just objects. They were something else, something sinister, and they weren't going to let me leave. The mannequins were everywhere, closing in from all sides, their grotesque smiles widening as they surrounded me. My heart pounded in my chest, the walls of the store seeming to press in closer with each passing second. Desperation gripped me, and I shoved against the nearest mannequin, trying to break through, but it was like pushing against stone. Their cold, plastic hands reached out, brushing against my skin, sending a jolt of terror through me. I was trapped. There was no way out, no escape from the nightmare I'd stumbled into. In a final, desperate act, I raised my camera, my fingers trembling as I adjusted the lens. Maybe this would be the last photo I'd ever take, a record of my final moments. The mannequins loomed over me, their eyes glinting with unnatural life, their hands stretching closer. I snapped the shutter just as one reached out to touch my face. Days later, my camera was found, lying abandoned in the dust of the old department store. There was no sign of me, only the eerie silence of the empty building. When the camera's memory card was reviewed, the final image sent chills down the spines of those who saw it. There I was, surrounded by mannequins, my face frozen in terror, my mouth open in a silent scream, as a cold, lifeless hand reached for me. The store remains abandoned, but the legend of the mannequins only grows, a warning to others who might dare to enter.
The cabin stood alone in the middle of the dense Pacific Northwest woods, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The road leading to it was little more than a narrow dirt path, winding through the forest and emphasizing just how far removed we were from the rest of the world. It was exactly the kind of escape we all needed. Rustic, charming, and completely cut off from civilization. As we approached, I couldn't help but notice how the cabin looked older than I had imagined, the wooden beams weathered and worn, the paint peeling in places. Inside, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the walls. The furniture was old, mismatched, and covered in a fine layer of dust, as if the place hadn't been touched in years. But there was a certain charm to it, a sense of history that made it feel like a real escape from our busy lives. We were all excited for the weekend. Just me, Claire, and my 3 best friends. Liz, always the planner, had already mapped out hikes and activities. Ryan, the jokester of the group, was cracking jokes about roughing it in the wilderness. And then there was Sam, quiet and thoughtful, who was looking forward to disconnecting and finding some peace in nature. As we settled in, the mood was light and carefree, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something about the cabin felt off. The layout didn't quite make sense, like the rooms weren't where they should be. And when I first stepped inside, I felt a chill, as though the place was watching us, waiting. But I pushed the thoughts aside. After all, we were here to relax. What could possibly go wrong? It was the first night in the cabin, and while the others were busy unpacking, I couldn't resist the urge to explore. The place was bigger than it seemed, with winding corridors and small rooms tucked away in odd corners. As I wandered through the dimly lit halls, something caught my eye. A small door nearly hidden behind an old bookshelf. It wasn't on the floor plan we'd looked at before booking the cabin. The door was plain, unremarkable, but the fact that it was almost hidden made it feel out of place, as if it wasn't meant to be found. A sense of unease washed over me, but curiosity got the better of me. I moved the bookshelf aside, revealing the door fully. It was small, almost child-sized, and something about it made my skin crawl. But I had to know what was behind it. With a deep breath, I reached out and turned the cold metal handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, steep staircase leading down into darkness. As I descended, the air grew colder, more oppressive, with each step I took. The staircase groaned under my weight, as if warning me to turn back. The dim light from above barely reached the bottom, where a small, musty room awaited. The atmosphere shifted from curious exploration to something darker, a growing sense of dread that settled in my chest. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, and filled with strange, unsettling objects. An eyeless doll sat on a dusty shelf, its head cocked to one side as if listening. An old, warped mirror hung on the wall, but when I looked into it, my reflection was distorted, twisted in ways that made me feel nauseous. But it was the journal that caught my attention. A thick, leather-bound book lying open on a rickety table. The pages were filled with frantic, disjointed scribbles about the Watchers. The handwriting was erratic, the words barely legible, but the fear behind them was palpable. As I read through the journal, the oppressive feeling in the room intensified. The shadows in the corner seemed to move, growing darker, heavier, as if something was watching me from within them. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. Whatever this place was, it wasn't meant to be found. The deeper I explored the room, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the cold or the darkness. It was a presence, something malevolent and unseen that felt as though it was lurking just out of sight, watching my every move. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air growing thicker with each passing moment. The shadows, once just dim corners, began to stretch and twist, creeping across the floor like living things. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. I was not alone. Panic gripped me, and I knew I needed to get out. I turned toward the staircase, but just as I reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang that echoed through the tiny room. The sound was like a gunshot, loud enough to make me jump. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath now visible in the freezing air. The walls seemed to close in around me, the room growing smaller, more claustrophobic. The shadows in the corners darkened, thickening like black smoke, creeping toward me with a sinister intent. Every instinct screamed at me to escape, but there was nowhere to go. Desperation took over as I threw myself against the door, pounding on it with both fists, but it didn't move. The journal on the table suddenly flew off, the pages flipping wildly as if caught in a violent wind, though the air was still. The whispers started then, low and unintelligible at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They came from all around me, surrounding me, filling the room with a chorus of terrifying, incomprehensible voices. My vision blurred with fear as the shadows began to take shape, coalescing into figures with glowing eyes that stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They moved closer, slow and deliberate, their presence heavy and oppressive. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as terror gripped me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figures closed in, their eyes glowing brighter, their whispers louder, drowning out all thought. I was trapped, surrounded, with no way out. My scream echoed through the cabin, breaking the eerie silence of the night. My friends, startled and confused, rushed to find me. They followed the sound, their footsteps heavy on the creaky floorboards, until they reached the hidden door behind the old bookshelf. It was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal the dark staircase descending into the unknown. Without hesitation, they threw the door open and hurried down the narrow steps, calling my name. But when they reached the bottom, the room was empty. The cold, oppressive air wrapped around them like a shroud. There was no sign of me, no trace of the strange objects I had seen, no indication that I had ever been there. The room was barren, save for the journal lying open on the floor. The final pages were blank, the frantic scribbles about the Watchers ending abruptly. As they stood in shock, trying to make sense of what had happened, the cabin's lights began to flicker. The air grew heavy, thick with the same malevolent presence I had felt. The shadows along the walls seemed to shift and twist, growing darker, more menacing. It dawned on them that whatever had taken me was still here, and it wasn't finished. Panic set in, and they bolted for the stairs, their fear driving them back toward the safety of the cabin above. But just as they reached the top, the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, the only sound was the creaking of the hidden door as it slowly opened behind them, followed by the same whispers that had filled the room moments before. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, as the screen faded to black, leaving their fate, and the horrors within the cabin, uncertain. The town of Wyndham was exactly what I needed. A small, secluded spot in rural Maine, tucked away from the chaos of the world. Surrounded by dense, whispering forests and bordered by a river that reflected the sky's endless gray, it was the perfect place for a fresh start. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so, with just a few locals who would nod as I passed, their eyes lingering a bit too long on me as if they wanted to say something but thought better of it. At the edge of town stood my new home, an old weathered house with a quaint charm that had immediately drawn me in. The house, with its faded paint and creaky porch, had character. It was the kind of place that felt lived in, full of history, but also somehow untouched. As I stepped inside for the first time, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm wash over me. The air was still, almost unnervingly quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The locals had seemed wary when I mentioned where I was moving, offering vague warnings about the place. But I'd brushed them off. I was here to leave the past behind and start anew. And this house, this town, was going to be my sanctuary. Still, as I walked through the empty rooms, a slight chill prickled my skin. The house was almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't alone, like something was waiting. I shook off the thought, determined not to let old superstitions get to me. After all, this was just a house. What could possibly be wrong with a little silence? The first few nights in the house were peaceful, almost too peaceful. The silence that had initially seemed comforting began to feel unnatural. I'd lived in old houses before, and they were never this quiet. There were no creaking floors, no groans from the wooden beams adjusting to the night's chill, no wind rustling the trees outside. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, distant animal calls, were absent. It was as if the entire world outside had gone still, and the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. At first, I welcomed the quiet. After the chaos of the past year, it was a relief to have some peace. But soon, the silence became unsettling. Little things started to happen that I couldn't explain. I'd find doors open that I was certain I had closed. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then the lights began to flicker. It wasn't the usual flicker of old wiring, though. It was deliberate, almost rhythmic, as if the house was trying to communicate something. Cold spots appeared in the rooms, patches of air that sent shivers down my spine, even when the rest of the house was warm. I told myself it was just the quirks of an old building, nothing more. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. As the days passed, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. I started hearing faint whispers, just at the edge of my hearing, so quiet that I couldn't make out any words. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized the whispers were inside the house. They seemed to follow me from room to room, growing louder when I was alone, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. My unease turned to fear, but I fought to keep it under control. This was just a house, I told myself. Houses creak, lights flicker, drafts cause cold spots. There had to be a rational explanation for everything. But despite my attempts to stay calm, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I woke up in the middle of the night to a silence so profound it was suffocating. There was no sound at all. Not the creak of the house, not the wind outside, not even my own breathing. It was as if the entire world had stopped, holding its breath along with the house. The air in the room was thick, almost oppressive, pressing down on me with a weight that made my chest tighten. I knew I should stay in bed, but something compelled me to get up, a force stronger than my fear pulling me toward the door. The hallway was dark, the shadows deeper than they should have been, the air colder than before. As I walked through the house, I felt as if I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. That's when I noticed the mirror. It was an old ornate thing, large and heavy, the kind of mirror that seemed to belong to another era. I had passed by it a dozen times without giving it much thought, but tonight, it was impossible to ignore. It drew me in, like a dark pool I was afraid to look into but couldn't resist. As I moved past it, I caught a glimpse of my reflection, and froze. My reflection wasn't following my movements. It was staring straight at me, its eyes dark and filled with something I couldn't describe. Something malevolent. A cold, cruel grin spread across its face, a grin that wasn't mine. My heart raced as I took a step back, but my reflection didn't move with me. Instead, it turned its head slightly, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Terror gripped me as I realized this wasn't a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. My reflection was alive. I watched in horror as it stepped forward, moving out of the mirror with a fluid, unnatural grace. The glass rippled like water as it emerged, solidifying into a twisted version of me, a doppelganger with eyes that gleamed with malice and a voice that dripped with cold mockery. It leaned in close, whispering in my ear with a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "This is my house now." I stumbled back, my mind reeling, but there was no escaping it. The doppelganger was real, and it was taking my place. Panic surged through me as the doppelganger stepped closer, its cold eyes locking onto mine with a sinister intent. I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. My heart raced as I spun around, searching for another way out, but every door I approached closed before I could reach it. The house that had once seemed so quaint now felt like a prison, the walls closing in on me as the doppelganger followed, its grin widening with each step. I ran through the house, desperately trying to escape, but the doppelganger was always there, blocking my path at every turn. The silence pressed in on me, so thick I could barely think. My breath came in shallow gasps as I realized the truth. I was trapped. There was no way out. The doppelganger lunged at me, its hands cold and strong as they wrapped around my wrists, dragging me toward the mirror. I fought with everything I had, but the house seemed to aid the doppelganger, slamming doors and pushing me closer to my fate. The last thing I saw was the doppelganger's twisted grin, full of dark triumph, before it pulled me into the mirror. The house fell silent once more, the only sound the soft click of the door opening. The doppelganger stepped out, now perfectly mimicking me, and walked to the mirror, where I was trapped, helplessly watching from the other side. It smiled at its reflection, a hint of malice in its eyes, as if daring anyone to discover the truth. Outside, the locals continued to avoid the house, knowing but never speaking of the dark presence within. And in the mirror, I could only watch as the life that had once been mine was stolen away.